team of Truthseekers is on a mission. Scientists, historians, archaeologists, all on the trail of history's enigmas. Searching for the truth behind the greatest mysteries known to humanity. She was one of the last pharaohs of the ancient kingdom of Egypt. She schemed and she killed. She fought and died for love. But what is true and what is legend? What do we know about the real Cleopatra? How did she die? And where was she finally laid to rest? In London, our team assemble. Our 4 Truthseekers combine decades of experience in different fields. But they all have one goal: to apply their knowledge and reveal the truth.
There are mysteries, and then there are mysteries.
I have always loved uncovering the secrets of the past.
We need to go back and unpick the untruths from the truths.
Age-old problems that we've been asking ourselves over 100 years, really, can now be solved.
They'll follow the clues left behind, unravel the secrets of the past, separate fact from fiction, and together they'll uncover the truth behind the greatest mysteries ever.
On the surface, the story of Cleopatra is a terrible tragedy that ends badly. But the reason that we're enthralled, we're fascinated, we're even supportive of her is that she is a woman in a man's world. And for a period of time, she holds her own against all the odds.
There are a few people in history, really, when we talk about their first names, we immediately know who they are. Cleopatra was one of these characters. We know immediately who she is when you say Cleopatra. These kind of transformational figures, someone who really changed the course of history, not only for Egypt, but really for the entire Roman Empire and what ultimately becomes the entire Western history. So she is a transformational character. And I think the fact that we can just say her name and we know who she is makes her really important.
I think Cleopatra is just one of the most fascinating women in history because so many people have tried to define who she was, and yet she remains this incredible mystery.
Cleopatra, one of the most famous women who has ever lived. 2,000 years ago, she was the most powerful woman in the world. She was one of the most influential figures in the death throes of the Roman Republic, but she wasn't a Roman. She made her kingdom more powerful than it had been for centuries, and then brought it all crashing down, ending a dynasty that began with Alexander the Great 300 years before.
What I can never stop thinking is, who is the real Cleopatra? There's gotta be a real woman in there. I think of a million different images from art, from theater, film, literature, and historical sources. It's kind of embarrassing being an academic, but honestly, what I think of when I think of Cleopatra is Elizabeth Taylor in the 1963 film.
Our Truthseekers want to discover the truth of her death. Was she poisoned? Did she commit suicide? Or was she murdered? And where does she lie in rest? To answer these questions, we must first understand how she lived. Anthropologist Dr. Karen Bellinger has been getting behind the myth to understand the woman.
I think the story of Cleopatra, as people tell it to themselves, has stood the test of time because it's got endless appeal. It's the fallen woman, and unfortunately, in patriarchal society, that's a very popular theme.
Cleopatra VII Philopator was the 14th and final pharaoh of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt.
The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by a protege of Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt and left behind one of his generals, who proclaimed himself Pharaoh Ptolemy I when Alexander moved on to continue his conquests. The Ptolemaic rulers were Macedonian Greeks who ruled from a Greek base within Egypt, in a city that they set up called Alexandria. and they continued their cultural practices, which included speaking Greek exclusively.
But Cleopatra was different to all those who had gone before her. She took the traditions and beliefs of Egypt to heart. When she inherited the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, in 51 BC, she changed the way her people reigned.
Cleopatra was really savvy, and she knew that to distinguish herself from her brother, it would behoove her to become the popular ruler among her subjects in Egypt. And so she not only spoke, but also read Egyptian hieroglyphics. And she was distinct in the Ptolemaic dynasty for doing so.
Speaking and reading Egyptian was something previous Ptolemaic rulers had deemed beneath them. To them, Greek superiority was everything. Cultural historian Dr. Fern Riddell has been looking at what motivated Cleopatra to move away from 3 centuries of tradition.
My name is Dr. Fern Riddell, and I'm a cultural historian. Her life is one that is beset by challenges really from birth because she's female. So to have such a strong personality, a leader, a kind of someone who wanted a lot from life, to be female straight off the bat is already something that she's going to have to work really hard to overcome. What we know of Cleopatra is that she was someone who was desperate to learn. So we think of her as someone who can speak 5 to 7 languages, someone who's very educated.
That education came with being the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world, Pharaoh Ptolemy XII. The throne of Egypt was in her family, but that didn't make it her birthright.
Cleopatra is one of many siblings, but she's obviously quite special in her family. I mean, she's very young, and she's made regent of her younger brother, Ptolemy. This is who she then ends up marrying and who her father decides she should be co-ruler with after his death. Now, Cleopatra is supposed to have a very easy transition to the throne. It's all set out legally in the will that she will be co-ruler and that this will be the future of Egypt. But I think given her personality, she wasn't someone who was going to accept being in control and being married to her brother. So very quickly we see civil war break out as Cleopatra decides that this is going to be her throne alone.
This was not the first Egyptian civil war of Cleopatra's life. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, inherited an Egypt in danger of being annexed by Rome. In a desperate bid to maintain autonomy, the pharaoh established an alliance with the Republic.
The Egyptians see Ptolemy's alliance with the Romans, his closeness to the Roman Republic, as a betrayal of Egypt, and he's deposed by his own daughter, Berenice. He's forced to flee under the protection of Pompey to Rome, and he takes Cleopatra with him. Cleopatra's grown up in a mighty city, Alexandria, but where she goes to now, Rome, is the emerging center of Mediterranean, and you could say global power. Rome is the new kid on the block, but it's the kid that's going to eventually rule everything in the Mediterranean. And she's exposed to all the politicking, the intrigue, the murderous plots, and you can't help feeling that this culture rubs off on her a bit. If Cleopatra needs an object lesson in how important Rome is in Egyptian politics, well, she learns it pretty early on because Rome helps to put her father back in power in Egypt. He then executes his own daughter, Berenice, and proclaims Cleopatra co-regent. All of this done with the support of Rome.
It was a rule that would only last a year. Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC and instructed that the throne should now be shared between his trusted daughter and his young son, who would become Ptolemy XIII. It was a rapid ascension for the 18-year-old queen.
Cleopatra is highly unusual as a powerful woman at this time. Ancient societies and the ancient world at large was not interested in women having power. We don't find incredible queens in Roman or Greek society. It's really unusual, and it says a lot about her personality.
Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII are now in control of Egypt. She's 18, he's 11. But his advisors are able to tap into the widespread feeling that a woman shouldn't be in charge. And so they plot against her relentlessly, to the point where eventually Cleopatra has to flee to Syria. And undoubtedly, Ptolemy's people think, well, that's the end of her. But they've underestimated Cleopatra.
Cleopatra formed an army and went back for her throne, sparking civil war in Egypt for the second time in a few years. With the sides evenly matched, both pharaohs see winning the support of Julius Caesar and the might of Rome as the key to victory.
The Roman Republic is going into its death agonies. Yet this period is throwing up some of the titanic figures, huge characters in Roman history. And three men are vying for control of the Roman Republic. Crassus, richest man in the Republic. Pompey, a mighty general. And Julius Caesar. Officially then, these three monster egos are supposed to run the Republic together, but that's just not going to happen. Somebody is going to emerge triumphant, and that will be Caesar.
On the verge of defeat in Rome, Pompey fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary and support. With Pompey's ally Cleopatra still in exile, young Ptolemy's advisors saw an opportunity.
Pompey flees to Alexandria, hoping to regroup and then resume his war against Caesar. Now, the young Ptolemy thinks that he'll be able to gain favor with Caesar if he executes Pompey, and that's exactly what he does, has him beheaded, and then presents the head of Pompey to Caesar.
Julius Caesar is devastated by Pompey's murder, or at least is allowed to kind of present his devastation for political gain. And it's a very dangerous moment for Egypt because Caesar could have swept in with the might of the Roman armies and taken over. It's a massive misstep. He obviously does it because he thinks it's going to ingratiate him with Caesar, but he doesn't understand the political machinations that are at play, and I don't think this is a mistake Cleopatra would have made.
An enraged Julius Caesar has the greatest fighting force in the world at Alexandria's gates, ready to seize Egypt for Rome. So how did Cleopatra, the exiled queen, save her people from Roman rule? And will this incredible story take us any closer to solving the mystery of Cleopatra's tomb? Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, a key player in one of history's great episodes. But much of her life and her death is a mystery. Now a team of historians and scientists has come together to tease out the facts. At the investigation headquarters, they review what we've learned so far.
So Ptolemy has made a terrible error, and Caesar is now in Alexandria. And Cleopatra is going to show us that she's learned a few political tricks in Rome, and she has enormous savvy. She is not going to let her brother's mistake be forgotten. She's going to ensure that this leads to his destruction.
So the civil war has reached a moment of incredible peril for Cleopatra. Caesar is in Alexandria, she's outside of it. So she has herself snuck in, we think possibly in a rug, to meet him, seduce him, we don't know. But this is the moment that really changes the entire power dynamic. This is the moment that really just changes the entire game.
Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing when she threw her lot in with Julius Caesar. And in fact, he aided her at the Battle of the Nile in obtaining sole control over Egypt.
With the assistance of Caesar, and after a prolonged battle inside Alexandria itself, her brother is exiled and dies during his retreat, and Cleopatra reclaims her throne to become pharaoh of Egypt once more. She is once again master of her own destiny.
When Cleopatra accedes to the throne, not only is she facing the challenges of being a woman, which was not really expected in Egyptian society that she would rule alone, she's also beset by famine and war and horror in civil society. So beset by these challenges, she has to consolidate her power base and really make sure that she has support outside of Egypt. We don't know at what point the relationship between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra moved from diplomats in conflict to lovers, but it definitely resulted in a son, Caesarion, So Cleopatra is making sure that the world knows that she has had a child by Julius Caesar.
Cleopatra was relentless in her mission to tie her fortune to that of Caesar, and despite him making no admission of fatherhood, it was known throughout the whole world that the child was his son. A bond of blood was formed that would cement the queen's place on the throne.
In a world where dynasty is everything, what Cleopatra has done is unite Egypt, which is no longer at the height of its powers, with the intense power of the Roman Empire. So Cleopatra is in her late teens, early 20s when this is happening, and it says an awful lot about her character that she walks into the political stage, this world of incredibly powerful personalities, and she doesn't allow anyone to push her around. Instead of being pushed and used as a pawn by these powerful men and by the men in Egyptian society, she stands above them, she really dominates and makes sure that her word and her ideas and her attitudes are what is being fulfilled.
And that meant the rebirth of Egypt as a power. Cleopatra aided Caesar in his campaigns, and they both reaped the benefits. His grip on power in Rome grew ever stronger, and in return, she and Egypt were gifted more lands to govern. Cleopatra, the Egyptian-speaking Macedonian Greek, had returned Egypt to power, strength, and glory, and for that, she was loved. After decades of turmoil, Egypt was thriving and at peace. It couldn't last.
It's 44 BC, and Julius Caesar has seen off his fellow triumvirs. Crassus is dead in Parthia, and Pompey is dead in Egypt. So he is the master of all that he surveys. He is the dictator of Rome. And for Cleopatra, this is amazing. She has really hitched herself to the right Roman horse. But as ever, pride comes before a fall in Roman history, and Caesar is assassinated in the Senate, and Cleopatra now finds herself back at square one.
Julius Caesar had loomed large over Rome for decades and was incredibly popular with the Roman people. His murder outraged the population, and civil war ensued. Cleopatra, robbed of her strongest ally, had to pick a side.
When Julius Caesar is assassinated, this is another moment of terrible peril for Cleopatra. And I think it's very understandable why she sides with Octavian. He's Julius Caesar's heir, it makes a lot of sense, but I don't think she ever expected what would come next.
What came next was a new Rome, led by the second triumvirate of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, an accomplished statesman, and one of Caesar's most trusted generals, Mark Antony.
Enter Mark Antony. You know, we have this image of Mark Antony as incredibly powerful, strong, a real military man. And I think it's a moment when Cleopatra's diplomacy probably fails her. You know, she's been so clever and so canny all of her life, but when Mark Antony walks in, everything else just fades away.
Cleopatra funded many of Mark Antony's successful campaigns against the Parthian Empire in the east, including the capture of Jerusalem, and in return, he convinced Octavian and Lepidus to reinstate much of Egypt's old Eastern Empire and empower their children. Egypt was as strong as it has been in decades. Cleopatra was riding high, but Rome was uneasy, and power was quickly shifting.
I think there's a real contrast with her relationship with Caesar to her relationship with Mark Antony. It's obvious that Caesar was very much a protector, someone that she relied on, whereas with Mark Antony, she's bankrolling him.
And just as with Julius Caesar before him, Cleopatra secured her working alliance with Mark Antony by getting close personally. But it was a partnership that would bring about the end of a 3,000-year-old empire.
Cleopatra has lived her life as this incredible diplomat, and her relationship with Mark Antony threatens everything. It's a terrible idea. Mark Antony is currently married to Octavian's sister, so leaving her, abandoning her, and marrying Cleopatra, having 3 children, it's only going to spell defeat, horror, war. You know, it's a terrible idea. So it's obvious that they fall madly in love. That has to be the motivation for it.
Throughout Cleopatra's reign, she was committed to the advancement of herself, her children, and her empire. Evidence suggests that every move was carefully calculated.
It's been argued that Cleopatra actually delayed the fall of Egypt to the Roman Empire for the 20 years that she sat on the throne. And that's because she played this game of placating Rome like a master. She shifted alliances as she needed on the fly in a way that men, I think, could not even conceive of, going from her original family association with Pompey in quick succession to Julius Caesar, and then in turn to Mark Antony. She was a brilliant tactician.
But for once, her tactics let her down. Whether she chose Mark Antony for political gain or she fell in love with him, it was the wrong choice, and one that would seal her fate.
There's a new triumvirate running the Roman Republic, and essentially Cleopatra has got to decide which of them is going to further her interests. But this time round, she does something different. She seems to go with her heart instead of her head, and she goes with Mark Antony. And this proves to be a terrible mistake. Mark Antony is spending an increasing amount of time in Alexandria with Cleopatra, but the center of power is Rome, and there is another power struggle now between Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian, by being in Rome, has the upper hand. Mark Antony, by being in Alexandria, is in a weaker position.
The fear was well-founded. For the next 5 years, Octavian politically destroyed Mark Antony, painting him as a traitor to Rome. And in 31 BC, Rome declared war on Egypt, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra.
It's really not much of a war between Mark Antony and Octavian, because Mark Antony's Roman troops really don't want to get involved in fighting other Roman troops. And as for Cleopatra's Egyptian military, well, they don't really understand what the conflict's about at all. They've got no interest in getting involved in a war and losing their lives for control of Rome.
The invasion began in the spring of 30 BC, and by August, Egypt was all but defeated. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had retreated to Alexandria, and when his naval force and cavalry deserted him, the war was lost. But this is where the mystery truly begins.
We don't really have a blow-by-blow account of this war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Our main sources are Plutarch, who's writing something like 200 years later, and then Strabo, who was writing about 20 years later. Now, that Greek historian may actually have been there and witnessed the events.
Strabo's version is that with Octavian and his forces at the walls of Alexandria, Cleopatra sends notice to Mark Antony that she has committed suicide rather than be captured and paraded through Rome. Upon hearing this news, Mark Antony draws his sword and plunges it into his chest.
The story goes that the suicide note from Cleopatra that Mark Antony received was actually a kind of notice of intention to commit suicide as opposed to, I'm doing it. Anyway, Mark Antony takes it very literally, stabs himself in the chest, and the dying Roman general is taken to his beloved Cleopatra and dies in her arms.
When we think about what Cleopatra might have been feeling at this time, she'd lost the love of her life, Mark Antony had died, and it's obvious that Egypt was going to become really a vassal state to Rome if Octavian had his way. So I think the terror, the horror, the defeat were certainly guiding principles for her. But she was also leaving behind a son. So we have to consider that perhaps, maybe there is some truth to the rumors that Octavian had her murdered.
On the one hand, getting Cleopatra killed makes a lot of sense. But there's another thought in which maybe he'd like to parade her in his triumph to Rome.
There are various theories about why Cleopatra might have taken her own life, but for me, I think it's certainly something that she would have seen as being the final act of a great leader. It's a final act of power. She's not going to be a victim, she's not going to be used, and she's going to die on her own terms.
While the suspicions that Octavian could have had Cleopatra murdered have always lingered, historians are in broad agreement that suicide is the most likely cause of death. How she committed suicide is a different question.
Details surrounding exactly what happened at Cleopatra's death are quite few and far between. But two things we do know: she was definitely in Alexandria, and she died with her two handmaidens.
The most common story about how Cleopatra committed suicide is, of course, with the asp, a snake, brought to her breast. And it's impossible to really say for sure if that is what happened. But there is a way in which that story of a snake, death by snakebite, really fits the narrative that Cleopatra told about herself to the world. And that's because the snake was highly symbolically connected to the notion of royalty in ancient Egypt and to the goddess Isis.
Isis, the great mother goddess of Egypt, was worshipped for thousands of years. First as the sister and wife of Osiris, the god of the underworld, but eventually as queen of the universe, controlling the power of fate itself. Throughout her reign, Cleopatra associated herself as the living embodiment of this most powerful goddess. Isis was closely associated with the cobra, or asp, and so it would be considered fitting that her living embodiment die by snakebite. But how likely was that to happen?
Octavian's forces mass at the walls of Alexandria and then enter the city. Cleopatra is put effectively under house arrest. Whether she tried to negotiate her way out or use her political savvy to charm Octavian, we don't know. This is all a matter of conjecture. Cleopatra then is confined to her quarters and she's guarded by Roman guards. And Octavian wants to parade her through the streets of Rome like a trophy. Now, she doesn't want that, so she decides to commit suicide. Now, the traditional story is that she had an asp, a particular kind of snake, smuggled in a bowl of figs. Well, it must have been a very big bowl because an asp is about 5 feet long, and it just beggars belief that you could smuggle in an asp even covered in figs past Roman guards. So what is more likely is that Cleopatra took poison. But visually, that's not so interesting. And down the centuries, artists have far preferred to depict Cleopatra's final moment as clasping a poisonous snake and holding it, preferably, to her breast. Some people have wondered whether Octavian basically let her commit suicide. It was a problem out of the way, in the same way that Mark Antony was gone, or why not just let Cleopatra do herself in? But knowing Octavian, his rather spiteful, vengeful nature, and the fact that he'd made so much effort to get his hands on Cleopatra, he was going to want his glorious triumph in Rome. And what was going to be the showpiece of that triumph but Cleopatra herself?
Whether by snakebite or poison, Cleopatra is dead. What happened next is the true mystery, as no trace of the Egyptian queen or her Roman lover have ever been found. The pharaoh Cleopatra, the last ruler of ancient Egypt, when facing defeat and occupation by the Roman Empire, she and her lover Mark Antony took their own lives. What happened next is a mystery. In London, a team of scientists and historians is sifting through the evidence, searching for clues, seeking out the truth.
Strabo wrote first about Cleopatra's suicide, and though he probably was in Alexandria at the time her suicide was thought to occur, he did not write it down until a bit later, 10 to 20 years later. But he is quite clear that she either committed suicide with a snake or perhaps by the application of a poison ointment of some kind.
There's broad agreement amongst historians that Strabo's account is accurate, that both Cleopatra and Mark Antony committed suicide in Alexandria and were buried together. Shared tombs were not uncommon at this time, but their deaths, far from natural, were the result of empirical power play. Would Octavian have let them be buried together? And can we uncover further clues about where to find the missing tomb? Dr. Mark Altaweel is an archaeologist.
The story of Cleopatra was quite fascinating, not only today, but certainly has been fascinating for quite a long time, since really the Roman period until today. People have been searching for her tomb, trying to find out where she was ultimately buried. But until now, of course, we haven't found any evidence. With the ravages of time, records have been destroyed.
The sands of Egypt have hidden a great many tombs across the centuries, the final resting place of some of history's most influential people, potentially lost forever.
There's been about 110, 100 or so pharaohs that have been discovered in ancient Egypt. But unfortunately, I think the vast majority, or even a large portion, of the 100+ pharaohs that we haven't found are probably never going to be found.
Cleopatra was the 13th leader of Ptolemaic Egypt, a dynasty that had lasted almost 300 years. But physical evidence of them is practically non-existent.
Until this day, we don't have a single tomb from the Ptolemaic period. This is the last great period of ancient Egypt. Yet we don't have a single ruler, a single burial from these last pharaohs. We think they may have been buried in Alexandria, but other ideas may exist. One of the ideas is that Tap Osiris Magna, which was found by Ptolemy IV, because it was founded by a king, it may have been a kind of royal city. So the idea that you have kind of royal mummies buried in a royal city seems to have potential traction.
The city in which the Tap Osiris Magna Temple was built was founded by Ptolemy II around 280 BC, just 48 kilometers west of Alexandria. It was an important port, but the temple soon dominated the skyline. It was dedicated to the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris, the gods also associated with Antony and Cleopatra. Over time, the importance of the city faded. The temple fell out of use, crumbled, and decayed. For 1,000 years, Tap Osiris Magna was forgotten.
Napoleon invades Egypt in the late 18th century, and along with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, his forces also discovered Tap Osiris Magna. Now, Napoleon doesn't just only bring in his soldiers, but he also brings effectively an army of scholars with him. They, in fact, help lead to the foundation of Egyptology as a study.
The city would be studied and regularly excavated for the next 2 centuries, but it wasn't until 2005 that the location was linked to Cleopatra.
Kathleen Martinez is determined to demonstrate that Tap Osiris Magna is the actual burial place of Cleopatra.
Kathleen Martinez is a Dominican lawyer and diplomat who turned a childhood obsession with Cleopatra into a remarkable new life in Egypt.
Kathleen Martinez is one of these really interesting figures. Unlike most Egyptologists, she comes at it with a non-academic background. She's a lawyer by training, has taught herself archaeology. She has self-funded her own excavations and sort of really changed her life.
In 2002, she was granted permission by Dr. Zahi Hawass, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, to take an Egyptian team and excavate Tap Osiris Magna.
In 2010, there was a discovery of a large statue, in fact, without a head, or at least there was no head, but a large statue was found.
The headless statue was Ptolemy IV, founder of the temple. But they also found a head with no statue, and it's believed that this was a carving of the pharaoh herself. This was Cleopatra.
There were a number of associated Greco-Roman finds, which got the team even more excited. And among them was about 40 coins bearing Cleopatra's image.
The discovery of these coins is a clear indicator that the temple was still in use during Cleopatra's reign. Could it be that the coins were left as an offering at the queen's grave? The coins were found in the temple itself, and traditionally, Egyptian temples were only used for worship. Burials were elsewhere. Then Martinez made a discovery that shook Egyptologists to their core.
The Martinez team made a really exciting discovery at Tap Osiris Magna, and that was mummy burials in a rock-cut shaft style that was distinctive to the Greco-Roman period.
And some of these burials were inside the temple, a total departure from previously known Egyptian behavior. It's believed that for anyone to be buried inside, the temple itself must have been of great importance. And these mummies, found in shafts 20 to 30 meters deep, were rewriting what archaeologists thought they knew. 2 of them were particularly intriguing. Could this have been what Martinez and her team were searching for?
There were 2 mummies found, both of which had these gold tongues. And the idea is that these tongues would allow them to speak to the god Osiris. So when one passes to the next life, one has to speak to the god Osiris, who is the god of the dead.
The woman is holding a statuette of Alexander the Great. She has an amulet around her ankle, which has a snake-like emblem. So she is mixing the symbols of the Macedonian Ptolemy dynasty with ancient Egypt, very much in keeping with Cleopatra. And the man who is buried next to her, his funerary mask has a cleft chin, has that kind of look of Mark Antony. And the temple behind them is the temple of Isis, which is the goddess that Cleopatra most closely associated herself with.
But there was to be a find outside the temple walls that added even more credibility to Martinez's claims.
Catherine Martinez also points to a necropolis that's been found nearby to this couple. And it's a graveyard, essentially, full of rich, well-to-do people of that time. Now, her theory runs that if you were a high-status person, you would want to be buried near to somebody very, very powerful indeed. And what better than to be buried next to Mark Antony and Cleopatra?
The design of the tombs is consistent with the era of Cleopatra, and all were carefully oriented in the direction of the temple. Could they just be believers? Or is Kathleen Martinez right? Is this a sign that someone of huge importance is buried here? Some of the mummies recovered might hold the answers.
The mummies were not in a great state of repair, but there were two that were extraordinary nonetheless. They were wrapped in gilded cartonnage, which would have been reserved for the most elite of society. It was a male and a female buried together, and the male bore gilded trappings associated with the god Osiris. The female was crowned, and she had a cobra perched at her forehead and a necklace with a symbol of the falcon god of Horus at her breast.
Gilded mummies are typically only found in royal kinds of tombs or burials. So we think out of the 10 mummies, 2 which are gilded, these are very important burials, perhaps even royal burials.
The mummies are clearly people of great import, but could they really be Antony and Cleopatra?
What's more likely after the suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra is that their bodies were simply discarded so that they didn't become the focal point of rebellion or even worship. So more than likely what we're looking at here are the graves of 2 priests as opposed to 2 people of royalty.
And the golden tongues found there may also not be as significant as first thought.
The golden tongues found in the mummies were intriguing too. Clearly this is further evidence for high status. But it does not in and of itself indicate that they are royal bodies. And one has to ask, okay, the tongue is something to enable the deceased to communicate with Osiris in the afterlife. What would Mark Antony want to be doing that for?
So far the evidence doesn't add up, but that doesn't mean we should rule out Taposiris Magna as a potential location for the tomb of Cleopatra.
There's still quite a lot to be discovered in this site. What we know from Taposiris Magna is this large temple complex, but these temples are often part of much larger towns. There might be other kind of major discoveries yet to be found.
Martinez herself estimates that they've excavated less than 10% of the ancient city. There are undoubtedly great discoveries still to be made.
Potentially geophysical techniques, GPR for instance, magnetometry, as well as remote sensing methods could enable us to discover the bounds of this site and perhaps try to get a better understanding where other tombs might be located and other buildings even.
It's too soon to dismiss Taposiris Magna, but the most obvious and most likely location is the home of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria itself. Has one of the most explored cities in history managed to keep a secret for 2,000 years? The final resting place of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, has been a puzzle for countless generations. The Temple of Osiris at Taposiris Magna has offered tantalizing clues that greater secrets may lay undiscovered there. But most historians believe the tomb is more likely to be found in the Ptolemaic capital, Alexandria, now a bustling metropolis of 5 million people.
Alexandria was the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire. It was the seat of power of all the Ptolemies, and they were buried there. The problem is, we don't know where any of the Ptolemies are. We don't know where any of their shrines, their tombs, their mausoleums are located. It is a complete mystery.
Alexandria was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great of Macedon, who at the age of just 25 had already conquered much of the known world. He wanted the city named in his honor to rival Rome as the greatest city in the ancient world. It would remain the Egyptian capital for almost 1,000 years, and it remains a hub of trade, culture, and education to this day.
Alexandria was an incredibly important city. It probably housed something like 1/5 of Egypt's population. It had two great wonders of the world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, but also the Great Library of Alexandria, which was, of course, the center of knowledge in many ways in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also across much of the world at the time.
The library was lost in a blaze in 48 BC, but the Great Lighthouse would continue to be in use for another 14 centuries as Alexandria remained a vital port linking the powers of Europe to those in the East and the Christian and Islamic worlds. Theories abound that the Ptolemaic pharaohs, Cleopatra included, are most likely to be entombed in the city that was their home. Like the great ancient pharaohs of Memphis and Giza before them, the still teeming streets of Alexandria could hold the answer to this mystery.
Cleopatra's Alexandria is now either underwater or under layer after layer of modern Alexandria because it's a mega city that's never stopped growing. So for archaeologists, it's a complete nightmare. But in 2018, a huge black sarcophagus was unearthed.
The black granite sarcophagus, weighing more than 30 tons, could only have belonged to someone very important. Its size and weight would have made it very expensive to craft, move, and bury. However, it's too plain to be a realistic contender as the sarcophagus of Cleopatra. But as it dates from the same period, it has given archaeologists hope that there are other undisturbed tombs under the city, though they face massive geographical challenges.
The coastline that we see today around the Mediterranean, particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, is quite different from how it was in the past, say around the time of Cleopatra, roughly 2,000 or so years ago. There's been massive upheaval, changes in the level of land, massive tsunamis even, which has really transformed the coastline. And so a lot of these ancient cities that would have been located along the coastline have really submerged in many cases. And this is particularly true in Egypt, where the coastline that we see today is quite different from how it was in the past.
The areas of Alexandria that remain have been built upon again and again for 2 millennia, often with little regard paid to the preservation of antiquities. It's only recently that the Egyptian government are allowing archaeologists the opportunity to study any finds and prevent further loss. This new policy has seen remarkable discoveries right across the city, but it's feared it may already be too late for Cleopatra.
It's hard to escape the fact that Alexandria has kept on growing for 2,000 years. Hoping to find Cleopatra's tomb, well, it's hoping against hope. The tragedy is we may never find her final resting place because the city that was her capital grinds on unforgivingly, and somewhere deep down below it, Cleopatra may be resting, but I'm afraid she'll be resting undisturbed for all eternity.
Alexandria was a Greek city in the center of Egypt. Greek was spoken throughout, and only Greeks could hold senior roles within its walls. Up until the reign of Cleopatra, it was rare for a Ptolemaic pharaoh to even set foot outside the city. This was their safe haven. The pharaohs felt the need to separate themselves from their people, and they did so on an island called Anti-Rhodos.
So according to the historian Strabo, the area known as Anti-Rhodos, ancient Alexandria, is where the Ptolemies built their palaces. And he also specifies that Cleopatra built her tomb in the grounds of her palace. So find her palace, you find her tomb.
The only problem is that Anti-Rhodos no longer exists. In the 4th century, a great earthquake in the Mediterranean created a tsunami that brought devastation to the coast of Egypt. It destroyed much of Alexandria's harbor and submerged the island completely. For more than 1,500 years, the ruins lay undisturbed until they were rediscovered in the 1990s by an underwater archaeologist called Frank Gaddio.
So Cleopatra's tomb then is going to be found underwater. And luckily in 1992, marine archaeologist Frank Gaddio discovered Anti-Rhodos underneath the sea just out from modern Alexandria. And he has been exploring that area ever since. Using satellite and radar technology, Frank has been mapping out ancient Alexandria under the waves, and he's exploring an area the size of Paris. And it has streets, palaces, statues, and really points to a sumptuous capital that Cleopatra ruled over.
With some of the best preserved ruins in the world lying just meters below the surface, Gaddio and his team have been able to get a glimpse of how Anti-Rhodos looked in the time of Cleopatra, and the proof that it was occupied during the Ptolemaic dynasty is there to see.
Anti-Rhodos was laid out in a very rectilinear manner, so it followed this kind of Greek or Hellenistic style of planning that we know existed oftentimes when cities or places were found by Greeks when they went around and colonizing regions. And Alexandria, being effectively a Greek colony, was certainly laid out in this way. Quite a large bit of Alexandria is buried underwater, so effectively they found palaces and large ruins, and a number of artifacts have been found off the coast of Egypt.
On dives through the submerged ruins of Anti-Rhodos, Gaddio and his team found themselves surrounded by an ancient Egyptian treasure trove.
A number of archaeological features have been found underwater, including statues, architecture, lots of small finds, for instance, just things like coins and other pottery and those kinds of things.
With everything from sphinxes and giant statues to columns engraved with hieroglyphs, the importance and grandeur of this area of Alexandria is clear.
The most important palaces were located on this island. Now, we do think that potentially some tombs should be found along this area of Old Alexandria.
With the search narrowed down to this one area, is it possible that the quest to find Cleopatra's tomb may soon be over?
Logically, there's every reason to suppose that the tombs of the Ptolemies will be in this underwater city waiting to be discovered. It makes complete sense. Why wouldn't they be buried there? But you know, the romantic in me wants to believe that we are going to chance upon the tomb of Cleopatra. What an event that would be to see that discovered. But the historian in me says, fat chance. There's really a very slim likelihood of coming across that incredible tomb.
Even today, more than 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra continues to fascinate and enchant the public and the historical community alike. The hunt for her shared tomb with Mark Antony goes on, and if it can be found, then perhaps we will have a greater understanding of one of history's most powerful and influential women. But until it is discovered, it and much of her life remains one of history's most fascinating mysteries.
Cleopatra is one of history's most recognizable figures, and she was the consort of two of the world's most powerful men at the time. And all of these things put her at a really dangerous crossroads between womanhood and power, and contemporary historians have punished her for that. And that's the record we have today, and it bears correction.
I think Cleopatra has endured because she is a woman who manages to stand out. You know, we don't allow powerful women in history. And the fact that she's never been forgotten shows just what an impact she had in her own lifetime.
The truth is out there somewhere. The quest for Cleopatra's tomb continues. She is so fascinating, so alluring, so compelling. Her story still inspires us, and so we go on looking for this tomb, looking for her final resting place. That quest never ends.